You are welcome to SBC 103D, which talks about protection agencies and community relations. We're still on the sixth and last unit that seeks to explain protection agencies, right of minorities, and violence. And on the fifth session, as we're going to discuss, it will tackle factors that may precipitate domestic violence. And I believe that we will have an interesting discussion as it has always been. So I urge you to come with me as we proceed. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the trigger factors of domestic violence, avoid such trigger factors, and educate others to also do so. What are some of the factors that could trigger domestic violence? In other words, what are some of the factors that will lead to domestic violence? Of course, there are several factors that could lead to domestic violence, and some of these factors could be social, emotional, or psychological factors, and religious. Remember, for the definition of domestic violence, we spoke about the psychological, social, emotional, and so on and so forth. But then you look at a few of them in this subsection. And the first factor would be the previous experience with the violence. Many a times, people who experience domestic violence as children are likely to engage in violence, and it is natural. It appears to support the maxim, violence begets violence. It is important that children grow up in an atmosphere of love and great care. Every form of toxic culture, such as wife battery, emotional abuse of husbands and wives, unnecessary violence meted out to children for at least offense should be avoided. This will ensure that children do not grow up in an environment where violence rather than love or empathy is a constant figure. When children experience so much violence, they tend to see violence as a normal part of life and to engage in domestic violence in their adult life. It is very true because we have gone through socialization, and one thing that we mostly learn is what we see. Okay, so the next thing is patriarchal attitude. The patriarchal motive of our society has generally made men to get away with things that could be called names for if they ever did them. Our society generally tolerates women's subordination, and because women are subordinated, whenever a man offends a woman, it is considered normal, and as a result, the offenders continue because they don't see any problem with it. The next thing is that of status inconsistency. Status inconsistency. And what can you say about that? Status inconsistency. Yes, so status inconsistency is when an individual has some status that rank higher than others that rank lower. For instance, one could be a traditional ruler of his village but a junior staff in his occupation, where he has to take instruction from a younger people who are his superior. Sometimes such inconsistency could cause some pent-up frustration in the workplace. If it's not properly handled, might result in violence in a domestic setting. This would be displacement of a sort, as social psychologists will call it. Yes. Now, the next thing is the interactional style, and this has to do with the way people interact with others. The interactional style of some people could easily breed quarrels and confrontations, which could lead to violence. For instance, each people are in domestic relationship to be always lacing their communication with expensive jokes and could easily provoke negative reaction from the other person, who could result in domestic violence. So it's not everybody that we joke of that sort with. The next thing we talk about will be alcoholism and drug abuse. And alcoholism and drug abuse has been found to be a leading factor to a lot of violence within the domestic settings. And last, we will talk about will be a lack of coping mechanism. And this is when people find it difficult to cope with the major life events such as unemployment, death of a spouse, major trauma. They tend to experience frustration and could develop violence tendencies. When such coping mechanisms are not available to address such events, they could alter their behavior and make them predisposed in the domestic setting. And then last, social isolation is when people feel social isolated. They feel that everybody is against them. So their natural reaction is to express their bad feelings through violence. Any question? I believe you have understood. Good. So all too soon, we've come to the end of this interesting session. In this session, you've been introduced to factors that could trigger domestic violence, and factors such as patriarchal attitude, alcohol abuse, interactional styles, lack of coping mechanism, among others, are discussed. Try your hands on these self-assessment questions, and it could guide you for you to understand it very well. And I believe that the previous ones, you had no problems with them. If you did, then let me call out the answers and then you check for yourself whether you are on the right path. So it asks what domestic violence is, and it is defined as any threats or physical activity that causes physical, psychological, and emotional harm to a person with whom the offender is in a domestic relationship with. And that is domestic violence. And the true or false question is false. I believe you got everything right. Interesting. So join me for the next session as we go through domestic violence, still on domestic violence. And this session, we'll talk about the role of the police in assisting domestic violence victims, which will be the last session for this unit, hopefully the last session for this model. Thank you.